The morning sun filtered through the white curtains of Linda's kitchen window as she stirred her coffee. Steam rose from the ceramic mug, and she breathed in the rich aroma of her favorite French roast. Saturday mornings, in Willowbrook Heights, were usually peaceful. The kind of peaceful that came with manicured lawns, expensive cars and driveways, and the quiet hum of sprinkler systems keeping everything green and perfect. Linda had lived in this neighborhood for 8 years now. She'd worked hard to afford this house with its granite countertops and cathedral ceilings. Every month she wrote that mortgage check with pride, knowing she'd made it to the good part of town. The safe part. The part where property values only went up and where she could walk her dog at night without looking over her shoulder. She settled into her favorite spot at the kitchen island, iPad in hand, ready to catch up on the news and maybe browse some online shopping. The neighborhood was still quiet. A few joggers had passed by earlier, and she'd seen old Mr. Peterson walking his golden retriever. Everything was exactly as it should be. That's when she noticed the girl. At first, Linda didn't pay much attention. Kids walked through the neighborhood sometimes, though not often. Most families here drove their children everywhere. But this girl was different. She was young, maybe 12 or 13, and she was carrying something, a bag of some sort, and what looked like papers or a clipboard. Linda set down her coffee and moved closer to the window. The girl was walking slowly, deliberately, looking at house numbers. She stopped at the Hendersons' place 3 houses down and walked right up to the front door. Linda watched as the girl rang the doorbell and waited. Mrs. Henderson answered, and Linda could see them talking. The conversation lasted a few minutes before Mrs. Henderson went back inside and returned with something in her hand. Money? Linda couldn't tell from this distance, but it looked like some kind of exchange was happening. The girl moved on to the next house. Linda felt something uncomfortable stirring in her chest. What was this kid doing? Going door to door in a neighborhood where she clearly didn't belong? Linda had lived here long enough to know every family on the block, and this girl definitely wasn't from around here. She picked up her phone and almost called her neighbor Carol, but then put it back down. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe the girl was just delivering something. But delivering what, and why was she taking money? The girl continued down the street, stopping at each house. Not every door was answered, but when someone did come to the door, the same pattern repeated. The girl would talk, show her papers, and often walk away with money in her hand. Linda's heart started beating faster. This didn't look right. This looked like some kind of scam. Or worse. Maybe the girl was casing houses, figuring out who was home, what kind of security they had, whether they kept cash around. Linda had seen stories on the news about criminals using kids to scope out neighborhoods because people trusted children more than adults. She moved to her living room window to get a better view. The girl was now at the Kowalski's house. Tom Kowalski was probably still asleep. He worked night shifts at the hospital, but his wife Diana answered the door. Linda watched as the same scene played out again. Conversation, papers shown, money exchanged. This was definitely not normal. Linda's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the girl was selling drugs. Kids these days started so young with that stuff. Or maybe she was part of some organized crime ring. Linda had read articles about how criminals used children because the law went easier on them if they got caught. Whatever was happening, it needed to stop. This was a safe neighborhood, a good neighborhood, and Linda wasn't about to stand by and watch some kid ruin that. She'd worked too hard to get here, sacrificed too much to let crime creep into her peaceful Saturday morning. The girl was getting closer now, only 2 houses away from Linda's own home. What if she came to Linda's door? What if this was some kind of setup? Maybe there were other people watching, waiting to see which houses had valuables, which residents were vulnerable. Linda's hands shook slightly as she reached for her phone again. She scrolled through her contacts and found the number for the non-emergency police line. But then she stopped. Was this really an emergency? The girl wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't breaking any windows or stealing packages. She was just talking to people. But something was wrong. Linda's instincts told her so. And in a neighborhood like this, you couldn't be too careful. Better safe than sorry. Better to call now than to regret it later when something terrible happened. She dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Hi, I need to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood, Linda said, trying to keep her voice steady. What kind of suspicious activity, ma'am? There's a young girl going door to door through my neighborhood. She's collecting money from people and I don't think she belongs here. I'm worried she might be casing houses or running some kind of scam. Can you describe the individual? Linda peered through her window again. The girl was now at the house directly next to hers, talking to Mr. Chen. She's African American, maybe 12 or 13 years old. She's carrying a bag and some papers. She's been going to every house on the street and people keep giving her money. Is she threatening anyone or acting aggressively? No. But that's what makes it suspicious. She's being friendly, but that could be part of the act. People trust. Kids, you know. This could be how they get information about our houses, our schedules, what we have inside. The dispatcher asked for Linda's address and contact information. We'll send an officer to check it out, ma'am. Please stay inside until they arrive. Linda hung up and returned to her window. The girl had finished talking to Mr. Chen and was now walking toward Linda's house. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. The girl smiled and waved, an innocent gesture that somehow made Linda even more suspicious. That's exactly what a criminal would do. Act friendly and normal to throw people off guard. Linda stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. She'd done the right thing. She was protecting her neighborhood, protecting herself, protecting everyone who lived here. Whatever this girl was really up to, the police would figure it out. She grabbed her coffee mug and retreated to her kitchen, away from the windows. The girl could ring her doorbell all she wanted. Linda wasn't answering. She wasn't falling for whatever scheme this was. Outside, she could hear the girl's footsteps on her front porch. The doorbell rang once, twice. Linda held her breath and waited. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away. The girl was probably going to the house across the street now, finding her next victim. Linda looked at her phone. How long would it take for the police to arrive? She hoped they'd hurry. The sooner they dealt with this situation, the sooner her peaceful Saturday morning could return to normal. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, her world was about to change completely. The police cruiser turned onto Willowbrook Heights, drive with its lights off but moving with purpose. Officer Martinez had been on the force for 12 years, and calls like this one always made him a little uneasy. Suspicious person reports in upscale neighborhoods often turned out to be misunderstandings, but they still had to be taken seriously. He spotted the young girl immediately. She was standing on the sidewalk in front of a large colonial house, looking at what appeared to be a list in her hands. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, wearing a bright yellow t-shirt and jeans, with her hair pulled back in neat braids. Next to her was a small wagon, with boxes stacked inside. Officer. Martinez parked his cruiser and stepped out. The girl looked up at him with wide eyes, clearly startled by the police car. He could see the exact moment when confusion turned to worry on her young face. "Hello there," he said gently, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I'm Officer Martinez. What's your name?" "Zoe," the girl said quietly, clutching her papers closer to her chest. "Am I in trouble?" Before Officer Martinez could answer, Linda emerged from her house. She'd been watching from her window and couldn't wait any longer. She hurried down her driveway, still in her house slippers and robe, her coffee mug forgotten, on the kitchen counter. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Linda said, slightly out of breath. "This is the girl I called about. She's been going door to door all morning, taking money from people. I've been watching her for over an hour." Officer Martinez looked between Linda and Zoe, trying to assess the situation. The girl didn't look like any kind of criminal. She looked scared and confused. But he'd learned not to make assumptions too. "Quickly, Zoe, can you tell me what you're doing in the neighborhood today?" he asked. Zoe's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm selling Girl Scout cookies. My mom said I could walk around the neighborhood today because it's safe here and lots of people buy cookies." Linda stepped closer, shaking her head. "Girl Scout, cookies? Officer, I've been watching her for over an hour. She doesn't have any cookies with her. Just papers and a bag. And people keep giving her money without getting anything back. Officer Martinez looked at the wagon next to Zoe. Can you show me what's in there, Zoe? With trembling hands, Zoe pulled back a small tarp covering the boxes in her wagon. Underneath were stacks of colorful boxes with familiar labels: Thin Mints, Samoas, Tagalongs, classic Girl Scout cookies. These are my cookies, Zoe said, her voice getting stronger. I take orders first, then I deliver them later. That's how my troop leader said to do it. Take orders on Saturday, deliver on Sunday. She held up her clipboard, showing order forms with neat handwriting. Names, addresses, phone numbers, and cookie preferences were carefully recorded in a child's careful script. Linda moved closer to look at the clipboard, her confidence starting to waver. But why were people giving you money without getting cookies? Some people pay when they order, Zoe explained. Mrs. Henderson always pays right away because she says she might forget later. Mr. Chen likes to pay cash because he doesn't. Like writing checks. I write paid next to their name so I remember. Officer Martinez examined the order forms. Everything looked legitimate. The handwriting was consistent, the information was organized, and several neighbors had indeed ordered multiple boxes of cookies. Where do you live, Zoe? He asked. On Oak Street, about 4 blocks away. My mom dropped me off here this morning because this neighborhood always buys lots of cookies. She said the people here can afford to help our troop. Linda felt something, cold settling in her stomach. Oak Street, but that's a nice neighborhood too. Why didn't you sell in your own area? I did yesterday, Zoe said. I sold to all my neighbors yesterday. My mom said I could expand my territory if I wanted to try to win the prize for most sales. The girl who sells the most gets to be cookie captain next year. By now, several other neighbors had noticed the police car and were coming outside to see what was happening. Mrs. Henderson approached the group looking concerned. Is everything all right, officer? She asked. I hope there's nothing wrong with little Zoe here. She's such a polite young lady. Took my cookie order not 20 minutes ago. You know her? Linda asked, surprised. Well, not personally, but she introduced herself very nicely. Asked if I'd like to support her Girl Scout troop. I ordered 4 boxes of Thin Mints and 2 boxes of Samoas. She was very professional about it. Had all the right paperwork and everything. Mr. Chen had also joined the growing crowd. Same here, he said. Nice kid. Very respectful. Asked if she could take my order and said she'd deliver tomorrow afternoon. I gave her cash for 3 boxes. Linda looked around at her neighbors, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. But she was going to every single house. That's not normal behavior. Actually, it kind of is, said Diana Kowalski, who had just walked over. My daughter sold cookies for 3 years. They're taught to be systematic to cover their territory completely. You don't skip houses because you never know who might want to buy. Officer Martinez was starting to get a clearer picture of the situation. He'd responded to calls like this before, though they usually involved adult door-to-door salespeople or political canvassers. But the pattern was always the same. Someone doing something perfectly legal and normal, but in a neighborhood where they stood out somehow. Zoe, do you have your mom's phone number? He asked. I'd like to give her a call just to let her know what's happening. Zoe nodded and recited the number from memory. Officer Martinez wrote it down and was about to dial when Linda interrupted. Wait, why do you need to call her mother? Isn't this investigation more important? What if she's lying about the cookies? What if this is all an elaborate cover story? The neighbors started looking at Linda strangely. Mrs. Henderson frowned. Linda, dear, what exactly did you think this child was doing? It looked like she was casing houses, taking money under false pretenses. You can't be too careful these days. Casing houses? Diana Kowalski looked incredulous. She's 12 years old, and she has Girl Scout cookies. Age doesn't matter anymore, Linda said defensively. Criminals use kids because people trust them. I was protecting our neighborhood. Mr. Chen shook his head. Linda, she showed me her official Girl Scout paperwork. She had proper order forms. She knew all about the different cookie types. She even gave me a receipt. This isn't some criminal operation. Officer Martinez could see that Linda was becoming more flustered as her neighbors questioned her judgment. He'd seen this before too. When people realized they'd made a mistake, they often doubled down rather than admit they were wrong. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "I understand you are concerned about your neighborhood's safety, but from what I can see here, this young lady is doing exactly what she says she's doing. She's selling Girl Scout cookies. But she doesn't look like she belongs here," Linda blurted out, then immediately regretted saying it. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Everyone understood what Linda meant, even though she hadn't said it directly. Zoe was the only black person in the group, the only one who looked different from the mostly white neighbors of Willowbrook Heights. Zoe's eyes filled with tears. "My mom said people might say that," she whispered. "She said some people might think I don't belong places just because of how I look. But she said most people are nice if you're polite and respectful." The neighbors looked at Linda with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. Mrs. Henderson put a protective arm around Zoe. "Honey, you belong anywhere you want to be," she said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Officer Martinez felt the familiar weight of dealing with a situation that had gone beyond simple misunderstanding. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number Zoe had given him. "Is this Zoe's mother?" he said when someone answered. "This is Officer Martinez with the city police. Your daughter is fine, but there's been a situation I need to discuss with you. Could you come to Willowbrook Heights Drive near the corner of Elm Street?" He listened for a moment, then said, "Yes, ma'am, I'll stay with her until you arrive." When he hung up, he looked at the assembled group. "Zoe's mother is on her way. She'll be here in about 10 minutes. Linda wrapped her robe tighter around herself. 10 minutes suddenly felt like a very long time. Dr. Catherine Williams was reviewing budget reports in her office at City Hall when her phone rang. Saturday meetings were a regular part of her schedule now, especially with the upcoming city council vote on the new community center. She'd been mayor for 2 years, but the workload still surprised her sometimes. She glanced at the caller ID and didn't recognize the number. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. "This is Catherine Williams. Is this Zoe's mother?" The voice was professional, official. "This is Officer Martinez with the city police." Catherine's heart immediately started racing. Every parent's worst nightmare flashed through her mind in an instant. Car accident, kidnapping, injury. "Yes, this is her mother. Is she okay? What happened?" "Your daughter is fine," Officer Martinez said quickly, clearly recognizing the panic in her voice. "She's not hurt and she's not in any trouble, but there's been a situation I need to discuss with you. Could you come to Willowbrook Heights Drive, near the corner of Elm Street?" Willowbrook Heights? Catherine's mind raced. That was the neighborhood where she'd dropped Zoe off to sell cookies, the safe, upscale area where she thought her daughter would be welcomed and encouraged. What kind of situation? "I'd prefer to explain in person, ma'am. Your daughter is with me and she's safe, but I think it would be best if you came down here." Catherine was already grabbing her car keys and purse. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Please stay with her." "Of course. Ma'am, we'll be right here." As Catherine hurried through the corridors of City Hall, her mind whirled with possibilities. What could have happened? Zoe was such a responsible kid, so careful and polite. She'd been selling Girl Scout cookies for 2 years now, and they'd never had any problems before. Maybe someone had accused her of overcharging. Sometimes adults got confused about cookie prices and thought the kids were trying to scam them. Or maybe she'd accidentally gone to a house with a "no solicitors" sign. Some people got really angry about that, even when it was just a kid with cookies. Catherine's assistant looked up as she rushed past. "Mayor Williams, I thought you were in meetings all morning." "Emergency with Zoe," Catherine called back. "Cancel my 10:30 with the Parks Department. I'll call you later." She'd learned to balance being mayor with being a single mother, but days like this reminded her how complicated that balance could be. When Zoe had asked to expand her cookie-selling territory, Catherine had been proud of her daughter's initiative. Zoe had already sold to all their neighbors on Oak Street and wanted to branch out to increase her sales. Willowbrook Heights had seemed like the perfect choice. It was close to home. The residents had money to spend on cookies, and Catherine knew the neighborhood was safe. She'd even driven through it that morning to drop Zoe off, making sure her daughter knew exactly where she was and when to call if she needed anything. Now a police officer was calling, and Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She reached her car and pulled out of the City Hall parking garage, trying to stay calm. In her 2 years as mayor, she'd dealt with plenty of crises. She'd handled budget shortfalls, infrastructure problems, and community disputes. She could handle whatever was happening with her 12-year-old daughter. But as she drove toward Willowbrook Heights, a different kind of worry started creeping in. Catherine had grown up in this city, and she knew its history. She knew which neighborhoods had welcomed black families over the years and which ones had been slower to change. She'd faced her own share of suspicious looks and uncomfortable questions when she'd first started attending city council meetings as a citizen advocate. Willowbrook Heights had always been one of the more progressive areas, or so she'd thought. The residents were educated, traveled, sophisticated. They'd voted for her in large numbers during the mayoral election. Surely they wouldn't have a problem with a polite young girl selling Girl Scout cookies. But then why was there a police officer involved? Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it quickly while stopped at a red light. It was from Janet Morrison, the city council president. Saw on social media someone called cops on a kid in Willowbrook Heights. Hope it's not related to your meeting location change. Everything okay? Social media. Catherine's stomach dropped. If this was already spreading online, it must be more serious than she'd hoped. She quickly typed back, "Handling it. We'll update you later." The light turned green and Catherine pressed harder on the accelerator. Willowbrook Heights was only 5 minutes away now, but it felt like the longest drive of her life. She tried to imagine what could have happened. Maybe Zoe had knocked on the wrong door and disturbed someone who was sleeping. Night shift workers sometimes got really upset about being woken up during the day. Or perhaps there had been a misunderstanding about prices or delivery dates. But deep down, Catherine suspected the truth was simpler and more painful. Someone had seen her beautiful, polite, well-dressed daughter walking through their neighborhood and decided she didn't belong there. It wouldn't be the first time. Catherine remembered her own experiences as a child, walking to school through different neighborhoods, having people ask her if she was lost or what she was doing there. She'd hoped things would be different for Zoe, especially in a progressive city where Catherine herself had been elected mayor. But hope didn't always match reality. Catherine turned onto Willowbrook Heights Drive and immediately spotted the police car. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, and she could see Zoe standing next to a uniformed officer. Her daughter looked small and scared, nothing like the confident young entrepreneur who'd left the house that morning with her wagon, full of cookie samples. Catherine parked across the street and took a deep breath. Whatever had happened here, she needed to handle it with grace and wisdom, not just as Zoe's mother, but as the mayor of this city. How she responded in the next few minutes could affect not just her daughter, but her ability to lead and bring people together. She got out of her car and walked toward the group. As she got closer, she could see the faces of the neighbors more clearly. Most looked uncomfortable, even ashamed. One woman, standing slightly apart from the others, looked defensive and angry. Officer Martinez noticed her approach and stepped forward. "Mrs. Williams?" "Yes," Catherine said, reaching for Zoe's hand. "I'm here. What happened?" But before Officer Martinez could answer, the defensive woman spoke up. "I called the police because your daughter was acting suspiciously," she said loudly. "Going door to door, taking money from people. I was protecting my neighborhood." Catherine looked at the woman more closely. She was middle-aged, wearing a bathrobe and slippers with an expression that mixed defiance with growing uncertainty. "Suspiciously?" Catherine repeated calmly. "She was selling Girl Scout cookies." "Well, I didn't know that," the woman said. "She didn't look like she belonged here. You can't be too careful these days." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine felt Zoe's hand tighten in hers and could sense her daughter holding back tears. Around them, the other neighbors shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed by their association with the woman who'd made the call. Catherine looked at Officer Martinez, who was watching the interaction carefully. Then she looked at the defensive woman, trying to see past the anger to the fear and prejudice underneath. This was the moment that would define everything that happened next. Catherine could feel the weight of it, the importance of choosing her words carefully. She was about to speak when she noticed something that made her pause. Several of the neighbors were looking at her with expressions of recognition. One of them, an elderly woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly. Are you Mayor Williams?" Catherine nodded slowly, watching as understanding dawned on the faces around her. The defensive woman's expression changed completely, shifting from anger to confusion to something that looked like panic. "You're the mayor?" she whispered. "Yes," Catherine said quietly. "I'm the mayor, and this is my daughter." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over Willowbrook Heights Drive. Linda stared at Catherine Williams, her mouth slightly open, as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. This wasn't just any mother coming to collect her child. This was the mayor, the woman Linda had voted for just 2 years ago, the woman whose campaign signs had been in Linda's own front yard. "You're Mayor Williams," Linda repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The confident, righteous anger that had carried her through the last hour was evaporating, replaced by a sick feeling in the pit of her stomach. Catherine nodded, her arm protectively around Zoe's shoulders. "I am, and I'd very much like to understand what happened here today." The neighbors who had gathered around were now looking between Linda and the mayor, with expressions of shock and embarrassment. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, wringing her hands. "Mayor Williams, I am so sorry about this. Your daughter was nothing but polite and professional. She took my cookie order just like she was supposed to. There was absolutely nothing suspicious about what she was doing." Mr. Chen nodded emphatically. "Same here. She had all the right paperwork, knew exactly what she was doing. I've bought Girl Scout cookies from neighborhood kids for 20 years. This was completely normal." Officer Martinez cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "would you like to explain to the mayor exactly why you felt it was necessary to call the police on her daughter?" Linda looked around at the faces surrounding her. Every single one of her neighbors was staring at her with disapproval. She felt completely exposed, like a spotlight was shining on every ugly thought she'd had that morning. I thought she was acting suspicious," Linda stammered. "She was going to every house, and people were giving her money, and I didn't know what she was doing. I thought maybe she was casing houses or running some kind of scam." "A scam involving Girl Scout cookies?" Catherine asked quietly. "I didn't know they were Girl Scout cookies." Linda's voice was getting higher, more desperate. "She didn't have a uniform or a badge or anything. How was I supposed to know?" Zoe looked up at her mother with confusion in her eyes. "Mama, I had my Girl Scout shirt on, the yellow one with the logo, and I had all my order forms and everything." Catherine looked at her daughter's bright yellow shirt with the distinctive Girl Scout trefoil logo clearly visible on the front. She looked at the wagon full of cookie boxes, the official order forms on the clipboard, the professional way Zoe had organized her sales route. "Linda," Catherine said, and her use of the woman's first name made it clear she knew exactly who had called the police on her child. "What specifically about my daughter's behavior made you think she was acting suspiciously?" Linda felt trapped. Every answer she could give would only make things worse. The truth was sitting right there in front of everyone, unspoken but obvious. She'd called the police because a black child was walking through a white neighborhood, and that had seemed wrong to her. Everything else was just excuses. She didn't. Linda struggled to find words that wouldn't expose her own prejudice. "I mean, in a neighborhood like this, you don't usually see." "You don't usually see what?" Catherine's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Diana Kowalski spoke up, her voice thick, with embarrassment. "Linda, just stop. We all know what you mean, and it's wrong." Linda turned to her neighbors looking for support, for someone who might understand her position. But every face she saw reflected disappointment and shame. These were people she'd lived next to for years, people she'd shared barbecues and block parties with, and now they were all looking at her like she was a stranger. "I was trying to protect our neighborhood," Linda said weakly. "I was trying to keep everyone safe." "Safe from what?" asked Mrs. Henderson. "From a 12-year-old girl selling cookies?" Catherine knelt down next to Zoe, who was fighting back tears. "Baby, are you okay? Did anyone say anything mean to you?" Zoe shook her head. "Everyone was really nice, Mama. Mrs. Henderson invited me to sit on her porch while I filled out her order. Mr. Chen asked about my other badges and told me about when his granddaughter was in Girl Scouts. I don't understand why the police came." Catherine stood up and faced Linda directly. "My daughter has been selling Girl Scout cookies for 2 years. She's one of the top sellers in her troop because she's polite, professional, and determined. She studies the product information, practices her sales pitch, and treats every customer with respect. Today she was doing exactly what thousands of Girl Scouts across the country do every year." Linda felt like she was shrinking. "I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Catherine said firmly. "You saw a young black girl in your neighborhood and immediately assumed she was up to something criminal. You didn't speak to her. You didn't ask what she was doing. You didn't check with any of the neighbors who had just bought cookies from her. You went straight to calling the police." The words hit Linda like physical blows. Everything Catherine was saying was true, and there was no way to deny it or spin it into something more acceptable. Officer Martinez had been taking notes throughout the conversation. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, "filing a false police report is a serious matter. What would you like me to put in my incident report about your reasons for calling 911? Linda's face went pale. "False report? But I really thought—" "You thought—" "A 12-year-old girl with official Girl Scout merchandise, proper order forms, and a wagon full of cookies was running a criminal operation?" Officer Martinez's tone was professional, but skeptical. Mr. Chen stepped forward. "Officer, I think we all understand what really happened here." Linda made assumptions based on what Zoe looked like, not what she was actually doing. Maybe instead of talking about false reports, we should be talking about how to make sure this doesn't happen again. Catherine looked at Mr. Chen with gratitude. This was exactly the kind of community response she'd hoped for when she'd first run for mayor. People stepping up to do the right thing, even when it was uncomfortable. "I appreciate that, Mr. Chen," she said, "but this isn't just about my daughter. This is about every child in our city who might face this kind of suspicion just for existing in certain spaces." She turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. "I know most of you voted for me because you believed in building an inclusive community, a place where all families feel welcome and safe. Today, my daughter learned that some people see her as a threat simply because of the color of her skin. That's not the community we're trying to build together." Linda looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. "Mayor Williams, I'm sorry, I really am. I wasn't trying to." "I believe you weren't trying to be racist," Catherine said, "but impact matters more than intent. The impact was that my daughter was terrorized for doing something completely normal and legal. The impact was that she learned some people will see her as dangerous no matter how polite and respectful she is." Zoe tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, can we go home now? I don't want to sell cookies anymore today." Catherine's heart broke a little more. This morning, Zoe had been excited about expanding her territory and trying to win the prize for most sales. Now she just wanted to go home and hide. "Of course, sweetheart," Catherine said. "Officer Martinez, are we free to go?" "Yes, ma'am. I have everything I need for my report." As Catherine helped Zoe pack up her wagon, she could hear Linda talking frantically to the other neighbors, trying to explain herself, trying to make them understand that she wasn't a bad person, but Catherine wasn't listening anymore. Her focus was entirely on her daughter and on figuring out how to help a 12-year-old process this experience. They were almost to Catherine's car when Mrs. Henderson called out, "Mayor Williams." "Wait. Please." Catherine turned around to see the elderly woman hurrying toward them holding an envelope. "I wanted to give you this," Mrs. Henderson said, slightly out of breath. "It's payment for Zoe's cookies plus a little extra for her troop. And I want you to know that not everyone in this neighborhood thinks like Linda. Most of us are better than this." Catherine took the envelope with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That means a lot." As they drove home, Zoe was quiet in the passenger seat. Finally, she spoke up. "Mama, did that lady call the police because I'm black?" Catherine pulled over to the side of the road and turned to face her daughter. This was the conversation she'd hoped to postpone for a few more years, but Zoe was too smart to fool with gentle explanations. "Yes, baby. I think she did." Zoe nodded slowly, processing this information. "Is that going to happen again?" Catherine wanted to lie, wanted to promise that it would never happen again, that the world was fair and kind and colorblind. But she'd learned that children needed truth even when it was painful. "It might," she said honestly, "but most people aren't like that, and when it does happen, we handle it the way we did today, with dignity and strength and by standing up for what's right." As they sat there on the side of the road, Catherine realized this moment was going to define more than just their Saturday morning. This was going to define how she led the city, how she talked about inclusion and justice, and how she prepared her daughter for a world that wasn't always fair. The story was far from over. By Sunday evening, the story had spread far, beyond Willowbrook Heights Drive. It started with a Facebook post from Diana Kowalski, who had witnessed the entire incident. She'd written a careful, thoughtful account of what had happened, explaining how a young girl selling Girl Scout cookies had been reported to police simply for walking through the neighborhood. Catherine first learned about the social media attention when her phone started buzzing with text messages from friends and city council members. By Monday morning, the local newspaper was calling for a statement. By Tuesday, regional news outlets had picked up the story. "Mayor's daughter reported to police while selling Girl Scout cookies," read the headline in the Metro Daily. The article was fair and factual, but it still made Catherine's stomach churn to see her family's private pain turned into a public news story. She was reading the article at her kitchen table when Zoe came downstairs for breakfast, already dressed in her school uniform. "Are people still talking about what happened?" Zoe asked, pouring cereal into her bowl. "Some people are," Catherine said carefully. "But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes when something unfair happens, talking about it helps other people understand why it was wrong." Zoe stirred her cereal thoughtfully. "My friend Aisha says her mom saw it on the news. She says it happens to her family too sometimes." Catherine felt that familiar ache in her chest. How many children in their city had experienced something similar? How many families had stories like theirs, but without the platform that came with being mayor? "That's exactly why we need to talk about it," Catherine said. "So people like Linda understand that their actions have consequences, and so people like Aisha's family know they're not alone." At City Hall that morning, Catherine's assistant had already fielded dozens of calls from reporters, community groups, and concerned citizens. Some wanted to express outrage about what had happened to Zoe. Others wanted to defend Linda or complain that the story was being blown out of proportion. Catherine spent the morning meeting with her senior staff, planning how to address the situation constructively. She didn't want to fuel anger or division, but she also couldn't let the moment pass without using it to advance important conversations about racial bias and community inclusion. "We've got requests for interviews from 3 television stations and 2 radio shows," her communications director reported. "Plus, the Metro Daily wants a follow-up statement, and the Community Justice Coalition wants to organize a rally." "No rally," Catherine said immediately. "This isn't about punishment or public shaming. It's about education and community building." Instead, Catherine decided to host a community forum at the library. Coffee and Conversations Building Inclusive Neighborhoods was scheduled for the following Saturday morning. She sent personal invitations to every resident of Willowbrook Heights, including Linda. The response was overwhelming. The library's main meeting room, which could hold 50 people, was packed with nearly 100 community members. People sat on the floor, stood along the walls, and crowded in the doorway. The audience was more diverse than Catherine had expected, with faces representing many of the city's different neighborhoods and ethnic communities. Linda was there, sitting in the back row, looking smaller and more fragile than she had the week before. Catherine had wondered if she would come, and was both surprised and pleased to see her. Catherine began the forum by sharing her own story. Not just what had happened to Zoe, but her experiences growing up as one of the few black families in a predominantly white city. She talked about the subtle messages children receive about where they belong and where they don't. She shared research about implicit bias and how unconscious prejudices can lead to harmful actions. "I'm not here to attack anyone," Catherine said, looking directly at Linda. "We all have biases. The difference is what we do when we recognize them." One by one, community members began sharing their own experiences. A Latino father talked about being followed in stores when shopping with his children. An elderly Jewish woman described having her synagogue vandalized and how that had made her feel unwelcome in her own neighborhood. A young white mother admitted that she'd crossed the street to avoid a group of black teenagers and later realized her own prejudice. The stories were painful, but powerful. Catherine watched as people who had never thought about these issues began to understand how their assumptions and actions affected their neighbors. When it was time for discussion, Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. "I've lived in Willowbrook Heights for 30 years, she said. "I thought I was open-minded and welcoming, but listening to these stories I realize I've probably made assumptions too. Maybe not as dramatic as calling the police, but assumptions, nonetheless." Several people nodded in recognition. This was exactly what Catherine had hoped for. Honest self-reflection rather than defensive denial. Finally, Linda stood up. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Catherine could see that she was trembling slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I owe Mayor Williams and her daughter an apology," Linda said. "Not just for calling the police, but for all the assumptions I made that led to that call. I told myself I was protecting my neighborhood, but the truth is I was protecting it from a 12-year-old girl who looked different from me." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I've been doing a lot of reading this week about implicit bias and racial profiling. I've been thinking about other times I've made assumptions about people based on how they look. I'm ashamed of myself, but I'm also committed to doing better." The room was absolutely quiet. Catherine could see that Linda was crying now, but she continued speaking. "I know saying sorry doesn't undo what I did. But I want everyone here to know that I'm going to work on myself. I'm going to question my assumptions, and I'm going to support efforts to make sure other kids don't go through what Zoe went through." When Linda sat down, there was a moment of silence before someone started clapping. Soon the entire room was applauding, not for what Linda had done, but for her willingness to acknowledge it and commit to change. After the forum, Linda approached Catherine directly. "Mayor Williams, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I'd like to make a donation to Zoe's Girl Scout troop, and I'd like to buy some cookies if she's still selling them." Catherine smiled for the first time in a week. "I think she'd like that. She's been worried that people won't want to buy from her anymore. Would it be okay if I came to your house to place the order? I'd like to apologize to Zoe directly, if she's comfortable with that." Catherine considered the request. "Let me talk to her first, but I think that would be good for both of you." That evening at dinner, Catherine told Zoe about Linda's request. "What do you think, sweetheart? You don't have to see her if you don't want to." Zoe thought about it seriously. "Will you stay with me while she's there?" "Of course." "Okay then. I think I'd like to hear what she has to say." When Linda came to their house the following Tuesday, she was carrying a small bouquet of flowers and looked nervous. Zoe answered the door with Catherine beside her, still cautious but curious. "Hello, Zoe," Linda said softly. "I came to apologize. To you directly. What I did was wrong, and I'm sorry I scared you." Zoe listened carefully as Linda explained that she'd made assumptions based on fear and prejudice. She didn't talk down to Zoe or try to make excuses. She simply acknowledged her mistake and took responsibility for it. "I'm learning about my own biases," Linda said, "and I want to do better. I hope that someday I can earn your forgiveness." Zoe looked at her mother, then back at Linda. "My mom says everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "You're a very wise young lady. Much wiser than I was last week." She ended up buying 6 boxes of cookies and made a $100 donation to the Girl Scout troop. But more importantly, she kept her promise to work on herself. She started attending diversity training workshops, joined a book club focused on racial justice, and became one of the most vocal advocates for inclusive community policies. The incident on Willowbrook Heights Drive became a turning point for the city. Catherine used her platform to launch a series of community initiatives focused on building bridges across racial and cultural divides. The Coffee and Conversations forums became a monthly tradition, addressing topics from housing discrimination to educational equity. Zoe went on to become the top cookie seller in her troop that year, helped by customers from across the city, who had heard her story and wanted to support her. More importantly, she learned that standing up for what's right sometimes means being uncomfortable, but that change is possible when people are willing to listen and learn. 6 months later, when Catherine was walking through downtown with Zoe after a mother-daughter lunch, they ran into Linda at the farmer's market. Linda was volunteering at a booth for the Community Justice Coalition, helping to register voters and distribute information about upcoming city council meetings. "Mayor Williams, Zoe!" Linda called out with genuine warmth. "How wonderful to see you." They chatted for a few minutes about Zoe's school and Catherine's work. As they prepared to leave, Linda turned to Zoe with a smile. "Are you going to be selling cookies again next year?" "Definitely," Zoe said with confidence. "I'm going to be cookie captain." "Well, you can count on me as a customer," Linda said, "and this time I promise not to call the police." They all laughed, even though the joke carried the weight of truth. As Catherine and Zoe walked away, Catherine reflected on how much had changed since that Saturday morning. One terrible moment had led to dozens of difficult conversations, which had led to real understanding and growth. It wasn't a perfect ending. Racism and bias didn't disappear from their city overnight, but it was a beginning, a foundation for the kind of community Catherine had always envisioned. One where a young girl could sell cookies in any neighborhood without fear, where mistakes could lead to learning, and where people could find the courage to change. Zoe tugged on her mother's hand as they walked. "Mama, do you think Linda is really different now?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "I think she's trying to be. And sometimes that's the best any of us can do. Keep trying to be better than we were yesterday." As they reached their car, Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Henderson. "Saw you and Zoe at the market. Linda's become quite the advocate for justice. Thought you'd want to know she's organizing the neighborhood to support the new community center proposal. Change is possible." Catherine smiled as she read the message to Zoe. Change was indeed possible. It wasn't always easy and it didn't happen overnight, but it was possible. And sometimes it started with something as simple as a 12-year-old girl selling cookies door to door, refusing to let fear stop her from believing in the kindness of her community.